Hi, welcome back to my channel. This is April with High Fantasy Writing. So in today's video, it's going to be a continuation of what I was talking about in the last video about different mindsets to go into critiquing with. So I had intended for these to be a single video, but at the end of that one, I kind of realized that it was a lot of content for a single video, so I split it into two. So here is the second part, some more specific do's and don'ts for critiquing when you go in, you see your partner's work, and you think, okay, what do I do? How does one critique something? So a lot of people kind of go into it thinking that they're editors, and unless your critique partner has specifically said that they want you to edit their manuscript, look for like proofreading, that kind of stuff, circle all the typos, fix the grammar, fix all of the little minutia of it, unless they've let you know that that's what they want, this is kind of the video for you. So we're not talking about grammatical edits, we're talking about more content critiquing. When you're looking at somebody's manuscript for the first time and thinking, okay, I don't know anything about this story, how am I supposed to content critique it? That's what this video is going to cover, and some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about maybe I should make a note on this thing that I'm reading, whether you should make a note on it or whether you should kind of take a step back and think, do I really need to make that note on their manuscript? So the first thing that might sound very obvious is to ask your critique partner what they're looking for. Now this might sound very obvious, but I found that it is not so obvious, as I have received work to critique myself and have given out my work to my critique partner. Not everybody, one, lets you know what they want out of their critique. Two, they don't always listen to what their critique partner has asked them to do with the critique. I cannot tell you how many times I have explicitly let my critique partner know, hey, I'm not looking for a stylistic edit, I'm not looking for grammar edits, just look at the content of my story, how it flows, how you feel about the characters, how you feel about the setting, how you feel the plot is going. Is it engaging? Is it boring? Does it drag in places? Are you even interested to keep reading the story? I'll explicitly let them know that, and then I get the critique back, and it's just a whole bunch of red pen circling grammar things and changing where commas should go, saying, oh, well, this needs to be written this way rather than that way. And I'm like, thank you for all that work you just put in. I can't use any of it. You just wasted your time. So it's really, really important to keep in mind that you need to have an open dialogue with your critique partner, asking them what they even want out of this critique. Sometimes people look for critique partners because they're thinking about one specific section of their book, say the romance, and they want to see how that romance lands. So they're not interested in the grammar or did you do the dialogue, like the punctuation around quotations correctly. They're not looking at that right now in their at the point they're at in their writing. They're looking for, does this romance land? Do you like the characters? Do you see the romance coming if they really want it to be obvious, or does a romance come out of nowhere? And either do they want the romance to come out of nowhere? Do they want the reader to be shocked and be like, oh my goodness, there's a romance, I didn't see that coming? Or do they are they thinking, oh no, I thought that their flirting was really obvious, but the readers are now saying like, no, that romance came out of nowhere, I don't know why they like each other. So sometimes people are looking for a very, very specific thing with their critique, and you need to know that when you're looking at their manuscript. You need to know what they want. And as the person giving the work to be critiqued, you need to make it very clear to your critique partner what you're expecting them to notate on your manuscript. Because just handing somebody your manuscript, there's so much you could do with that. There are so many different aspects of it that you could go into depth talking to the person about, things that you think should change or things that you really like and think that should stay. But it's almost impossible for you to do all of those in a single critique. So knowing exactly what your critique partner is looking for is going to save you a lot of time. As you're actually going through the manuscript, you can just look for one thing instead of spending hours and hours combing through looking for grammar and style and where the chapter breaks are and the plot, the characters, the themes. All of these things is going to take you so long to get through, and knowing specifically what they want is going to really cut down the time that you're sitting there looking at their manuscript. And it's really going to streamline the process so that you can really truly focus on that one thing and give much better critiques, much deeper critiques, and much more complex critiques than trying to broad strokes do everything. That half of it, the critique, the person who's giving you their manuscript might be like, well, I can't use so much of this, and you just wasted your time. So once you know exactly what your critique partner is looking for in the critique, now you can sit down and start reading their manuscript, thinking about that, and making comments very specifically tailored to what they're looking to get out of this critique. One thing that I have found to be extremely helpful when receiving back my critiques and seeing their comments, and that many critique partners have let me know is a very helpful thing that I do in critiques, is leaving inline comments. So these are kind of stream of consciousness comments that you can make in the manuscript. So as you're reading, if you read a line and it really evokes something in you, or like an emotion that's like really great at creating a creepy atmosphere, or you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, I am so inspired, I want to live in this world. Those are really great things to highlight in the manuscript and write a little inline comment just saying, that was a fantastic way to word this, that really made me feel this way, or this is what the vibe I'm getting from this world through this paragraph or this sentence or this dialogue or something. That can be very helpful to the person receiving back the critique, because they know where their strengths are. They know if, say, maybe they wrote a line and they thought, oh, this kind of feels melodramatic, but I really like it and I want to see what others think. If you highlight that line and say, this is fantastic, then they know that they hit the mark, that they weren't being melodramatic. They really impacted the reader with that. So they know to keep doing that in their writing, that it's okay, that they're not hurting their writing by having that type of style. A thing to keep in mind, though, about inline comments is you don't want them to turn into highlighting when a character does something and asking a question that you expect to be answered by the author. So say the character has a horse that's very fast, and there's a little bit about, like what type of horse it is or why it's so fast, but it's just a really little slice. And if you highlight that and say, I don't understand why she would have such a fast horse, that's not very helpful to the author, because maybe it's going to be revealed later, but it can feel, when you're reading that as the person who's asking for the critique, it can feel like the critique partner is asking, like I said in my previous video, to have a whole character sheet handed to them in the first chapter. Instead of letting the story unfold in front of them, having sometimes asking very pointed questions like that in a way that makes it seem like you want an answer right now, like you're handing back the first chapter and saying, okay, now I need you to send me a message saying, like, answering that question, please. That can be very frustrating for an author because you're like, okay, well, this is going to be revealed throughout the book. And so I don't know if I'm writing poorly because you don't know the answer to this question, or if it's turning you off from the book because you don't know the answer to this question. Sometimes it can be very ambiguous when you ask very pointed questions in your inline comments. So something I suggest is to add a little notation if something that you read evokes a question in you about the story. Go ahead and put in your inline comment, I'm not expecting you to answer this. This is just a question that popped up in my mind that I'm really looking forward to learning the answer to, or something like that. So the person who's receiving the critique understands that you don't want the answer right now. You don't want the author to come to you and actually tell you the answer. It's just a question that popped up, and you're thinking, okay, I'm excited to learn when you, the author, have decided to tell me. This can also go for predictions that you might start having throughout the story. If a certain line of dialogue kind of gets the gears going and thinking, oh wait, maybe what they think is happening isn't actually happening, and maybe this is what's happening. Letting the author know in the moment when you're reading it what you're predicting, what you're seeing through the story is very, very helpful to the author, because when they either know if their foreshadowing is landing or if their foreshadowing is way too obvious. Because if you are looking to have it kind of a mystery or kind of some shocking reveals throughout the story, and then in your second chapter, your critique partner has already called every single plot twist or surprise or climax or resolution that you have, then you need to know that as an author, whether or not you're being too obvious with your foreshadowing, whether your story is too predictable or not. Maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want your story to be very predictable, but like maybe they get what the climax is going to be, but you're really excited because you're like, okay, yeah, they know what the climax is going to be. That's cool. I'm fine with that. But I want to see how excited they get in the build-up. See if what I've written is a very different type of build-up to that climax, where the reader then begins to start question, like, oh, I thought I knew what the climax was going to be, but now I'm not so sure because it's different. All of those things are very useful to know as an author. So when you're critiquing someone's work, just stream of consciousness inline comments can be extraordinarily helpful. Along with this, you can highlight certain sections that you would like expanded in their work. So if there's a very short description of, say, the castle that the person is going to, and you're like, okay, that's you're not giving me much on the feeling of the castle, what it looks like, because architecture, the people around the castle, how loud the city is, how quiet the city is, can be very important to the story and setting the scene. And so if you want to see more description, maybe there's what you feel is a very emotionally impactful scene, but it's over very quickly. Maybe talking to the author and saying, hey, I feel like this is such an impactful moment for the character. I want to see every detail of it. I think that would really help the reader see exactly how impactful it is for the character. I'd like to see this expanded if you wanted to do more internal dialogue, if you really wanted to draw out the actions instead of just saying he forged the hammer. If like if this character, hammers are very like important to them, the creation of something is very important to them, instead of having a very quick he built the hammer, letting the author know, I want to feel every single strike of the hammer on iron as he is forming his hammer. I want to feel the sweat drip down his face. I want him to feel the heat of the forge. I want to see all of the internal aspects of him creating this thing that I feel like as a reader would make this scene much more impactful to me. Impactful like I can see it is for the character. Leaving comments like that is also very helpful for authors because then we have a place to jump off from. We can see like, oh, okay, in my mind, I know exactly how impactful this is to the character. I'm feeling it because I know this character so well, I know this scene so well, but in order to know whether or not what you're feeling is also translated to the reader, critique partners are extremely helpful for that, and letting the author know if it didn't quite land for you, if you can see where there's supposed to be a lot of emotion or there's supposed to be this grand feeling that you're getting from the work, but you're not quite getting it, but expanding that scene would help. It's really great for authors to know that sort of thing in the critique as well. This also kind of goes hand in hand with predictions or questions you have about the story. You can highlight a certain area because maybe the character has a very cool weapon and it's just briefly mentioned that they have a very cool weapon, but there's not much to it. You can highlight that and say, I'm really excited to see how you expand on this. I really hope that you expand on this, that type of thing, to let the author know that, number one, if they have already expanded on it in later chapters, they're like, okay, awesome. The reader is looking forward to that. I'm not just shoving in unnecessary information that they're going to be bored by. Or it can let them know, oh, I didn't realize readers were going to cling to that so much. So let's go in and let's expand on it more. And so that I can have more background on this really cool weapon that the character has, maybe tie it into their backstory, maybe tie it into the themes of the story, maybe tie it into something that's going to happen in the future with them. It's really great for authors to know which details and little aspects of the story the reader latches onto and wants expanded. Now, something a little bit more serious about critiquing is you always want to be careful about how you word things. You don't want to feel like you're attacking the author if you see an issue, maybe something that you consider a very serious issue in the book. You don't want to seem like you're attacking the author, but it is really, really important to let the author know if you're seeing some harmful stereotypes, if the romance that you can tell the author wants to be super romantic, if it's actually pretty abusive, you need to let the author know. So you can phrase, say, the possible abusive relationship in a way that says, these 3 actions that one of the characters takes is quite abusive, and so I just want to let you know that's how it's reading. And so if that is what you want it to be, if, say, the author does have a reveal later on that the main character thought that that was a romantic relationship, but then realizes, they have a realization that it was abusive, then that's all good. But if the author doesn't even realize that the actions that a certain character is taking are abusive, they might be just going through the entire romance thinking, oh, this is a wonderful romance, and people are going to read it as a wonderful romance. But if that's not how you're reading it, it is absolutely okay for you to let them know, hey, I don't think this is landing the way you want it to land. This also goes for harmful stereotypes. If you have certain characters that are certain races or certain classes or certain sexualities, and you're reading it and you're like, this is kind of just a cut and dry stereotype that is very harmful to the group that it's stereotyping, it's absolutely okay to let the author know. This can happen, like, say, Jar Jar Binks, as an example, in Star Wars. Star Wars is a fantasy world, but Jar Jar had a what many people saw as a very strong Jamaican accent, and making him the bumbling fool, the one who's always messing things up, the one that not a lot of people enjoyed as a character, that can be very harmful to Jamaican people when they see that representation of themselves. Because honestly, how many Jamaican people do you see in stories? You don't get a lot of representation in that way. And when you decide to put representation in your book, you need to make very, very certain that you're not making it based off of harmful stereotypes that somebody who might be of that group is gonna see and not feel the greatest about themselves when they see, oh my gosh, there's a character that's like me. Oh, that's how you decided to write them. It's absolutely okay to let your the person who you're critiquing for know that, hey, this is the way it's coming off to me, and I feel like you need to maybe rework this or be very cognizant of the fact that these are harmful stereotypes that this group of people already goes through. And so maybe making sure that there's more to them than that stereotype. So maybe you have a gay guy who really likes shopping in your story. There's nothing wrong with gay guys liking to shop. But if that's their whole personality, it's absolutely okay for you as the critique partner to let the author know, I really like this character. I think that there's a lot of places to go with them, but make sure that the gay guy who likes to shop is not his only characteristic. Make sure you give him layers and more things than just the stereotype that I'm currently seeing in here. So it can be very difficult to broach those types of subjects with your critique partner because you don't want them to feel like you're attacking them or you're saying, you're a bigot for doing this, because this is a draft. I know that I have made some mistakes with characters and characterizations of different situations in my writing that then I looked back a couple of years later at, and I'm like, oh no. Thank goodness I never got that published because I need to change that. I either didn't realize it at the time, I wasn't aware of the certain stereotypes or something like that. So it's not always the author being malicious towards the group of people. Sometimes it's just ignorance, and as soon as you point it out to them, usually they're very, very grateful and they're like, oh my gosh, thank you for pointing that out. I don't want to have any negative stereotypes of people in my book. I want every single one of my characters to be a deep, complex, incredible character. They can be flawed, absolutely, but I usually people are aware and don't want to create stereotypes, just flat stereotypes in their writing. So those are some of the things to do when you are a critique partner, getting the manuscript for the first time and going through and deciding what do you want to comment on. Those are some of the good things to include in your critiques. Now we're on to the things to not not do in your critique that I have learned from experience, receiving my manuscript back, looking through, and just kind of not being the happiest camper and being very frustrated, and kind of feeling bad that the critique partner has just wasted their time. So, like I said at the beginning, talking about figuring out what your critique partner wants out of the critique, if they do not ask for grammatical edits, it's okay to like circle the typo and be like, I'm pretty sure you mean this word here, I'm just checking. Or maybe you just didn't catch it because, I mean, come on, when we're reading the exact same thing over and over and over again, our own writing, we know what it's supposed to say. So sometimes we miss things that are, maybe they are words, but there's just one letter dropped that totally changes the meaning, but we don't realize it when we're going through. Catching little typos like that, perfectly fine to just like kind of circle it and be like, hey, just noticed this little typo, just wanted to, let you know, you're all good though. But if you go into a critique where they did not ask for grammatical edits, and you decide to turn into your high school literature teacher and get out that red pen and start circling those grammatical edits, it's very overwhelming, especially for somebody who is getting their critique back for the first time, because maybe the person is brand new to critiquing and then you just throw all of this on them. It really bogs them down and they can't find the good parts of the critique that are useful to them. They're just seeing a whole lot of red ink, and that might shut down their brain, or that might just be incredibly frustrating and just be like, okay, I get it. You've changed commas like 15 times already in this first page. I get it. Apparently, I don't know how to use commas. Can we just move on? And so that can be some of the unintended consequences of you deciding to do a grammatical edit when it was not asked for. A situation that actually happened with my first critique partner that I ever had, I didn't really know to explicitly let them know what type of critique I wanted. I just assumed that since I was on a critique match site and not an editing site, that they would understand that I wasn't looking for very strict proofreading grammatical edits. So I wasn't very clear in my intentions for the critique. And the critique partner didn't even finish my first chapter. They got halfway through. They were just almost solely fixing grammatical errors that they thought I had made, circling sentences that went beyond 2 lines in the manuscript and saying, you need to cut this in half. They didn't even finish my first chapter. They claimed that it just wasn't polished enough for them, because I didn't know how to do the dialogue, the punctuation at the end of dialogue. So when you end a quotation and then have a dialogue tag, I still don't know, honestly, if that needs to be a period or a comma. I mean, I just kind of put what feels right. Like if the sentence of dialogue is a full sentence, I just put a period and then do the dialogue tag. But apparently that is not always correct. And they decided to notate every single one of those. And then the only really other grammatical issue they had with my writing was that some of my sentences were more than 2 lines long. They decided that that was just too hard for them to read and stopped reading my manuscript, my first chapter. They stopped in the middle and said, you need to go through and polish this more before I would be able to critique it. That is a bad thing to do as a critique partner. When somebody is handing you a draft, they know it needs grammatical work. They know it's not polished. That's kind of the point, is it's a rough draft that they're seeing if the content is right. So when you decide upon yourself that they need to have it absolutely polished to a shine, not have a single grammatical error, and you just refuse to critique their content because you're so wrapped up in grammar, that's not helpful for the author at all. You are just wasting your time either making all of those grammatical edits or just sending it back without even critiquing it. It's very disrespectful to the author, and it's just don't do it. If they don't ask for grammatical edits, do not send their manuscript back to them and say, I can't read this because of the grammatical issues in it. Now, if it is unreadable, you actually can't tell what they're trying to say, then it's okay to go to them and say, hey, I'm really not understanding what you're trying to say in this chapter because a lot of wrong words are used. The sentence structure is so confusing that I just am not sure what the sentence is even saying. That's okay to go to them. But if it's just some commas are misplaced, just get over yourself and accept that their grammar isn't perfect, but they're looking at content. So don't do grammatical edits if they are not asked for. Because a lot of times when you do all those grammatical edits and you kind of get on your high horse and think, ha, I'm a better writer than them, I'm gonna fix all their grammatical issues, you ignore the story itself. And the person who stopped reading my manuscript didn't really have many notations on the story itself. They just had issues about the way I said things, the grammar in it, and how long the sentences were. They didn't really make any comments about the story, which is really what I was looking for, was the story. How do you feel about my story? They had no notes about that. So when you bog yourself down with grammatical edits, you ignore the important stuff about a critique. Going in line with this, do not try to change the author's writing style. Everyone has a unique style. They have their own, and they are the ones writing the story, not you. If you think that this change in style, if you think that, oh, well, short sentences are better than long sentences, so I'm going to circle every long sentence and tell them to change it to make it a shorter sentence, that's trying to change their style, and it's not useful. It's you trying to take their story and say, I'm the author now. I'm gonna write this story now. Stop. Don't do that. Don't try to change their style. If you really don't like passive voice, but they use passive voice in a scene, don't point it out and say, never use passive voice, because maybe that's their style. Their writer's voice is using a good bit of passive voice. That's absolutely okay. And you can notate it and say, I see you use passive voice a lot. This is what it does to the writing. So if that's the vibe you're going for, go for it. But I just want to let you know that that is the vibe that passive voice gives off. That's totally okay to let them know the feelings and the vibe that their writing style is giving off, rather than saying, you need to change this because it's bad. Because it's not bad. It's just a different writing style that maybe the YouTube channels you watch that give you writing advice don't like. Maybe they don't like that. Maybe you don't like that. But that doesn't mean that that style is wrong. And trying to go in and completely change an author's writing style is not helpful critique, and it's not helpful for their writing, it's not helpful for your writing, and it just makes it seem like you think you know best and you actually want to be the one writing this story. So don't think that you're a writing god because you can highlight a bunch of sentences and say, you need to rewrite this in this way, and think that that's somehow helpful to the author. Because if it doesn't actually help you understand what's happening in the scene better, it's just a stylistic preference that you have. Say you like one type of perfect tense better than another type of perfect tense, and you go through and say, change all of this other thing to this thing. It's not helpful, you're just being annoying, honestly. Everyone has their own style of writing. They all have ways that they prefer things to be worded. They all have their preferred language that they like to use. Which synonym of black do you like for describing a person's black hair? Do you like raven hair, inky dark hair, midnight hair? Just because somebody has used one of those synonyms that you personally wouldn't have used doesn't mean that they did it wrong. It just means that you two are different writers, and it's okay that they're not a carbon copy of you. So don't try to say, ugh, you said that it was raven hair. That's so obnoxious. You need to change it to midnight hair. Or just say black hair. Don't give anything stylized about it at all. Just say black hair. That's not really helpful advice. You can highlight it and say, this is giving me X vibes when you say raven hair, because say it was used a lot in paranormal romance YA books. So you can highlight it and say, I get a very paranormal romance vibe from this description of black hair because it's been so used in those types of work. So maybe take a look at it and think, are you okay with that being an association with that type of description? Or do you not want to even be associated with that, and do you want to change the descriptor? That type of comment is much, much more helpful to authors than just saying raven hair is overused, you need to change it to X. That's not as helpful as describing what the style that they're going for or what they've done, describing that style and saying, okay, this is what this style is giving me, this is how the style is making me feel, this is the genre that I'm feeling from this style. That is much more helpful than saying you need to change your style to this style. Along with this, in your critiques, don't just become a thesaurus. So I have had critique partners that would highlight descriptions that I did and say, oh, you need to change this term to this term, or this term to this term. Because I'm writing a fantasy, they would try to take away any modern language, which if you actually look into history and like read people's diaries from back then, you would be shocked at how modern sounding their words were. Like, everybody in medieval Europe didn't speak like Shakespeare talk. Like, everybody didn't speak in sonnets. Everybody didn't use like thee and thou and thy and say, ha, my brother. Like, that wasn't how people actually talked. And so when you're writing a fantasy, some people get it into their head that you need to use fantasy sounding words, and that if your word choice isn't a fantasy sounding word, then you need to change it to make it sound more fantasy. There was a point in one of mine where somebody highlighted, one of my characters was talking, they're discussing different plans, and my character said, that's an idiot's plan. The critique partner highlighted it and said, fool's errand. And I'm like, why? Why? Genuinely, if you are telling them to go through a thesaurus and find a synonym for a word, you need to explain in detail to the author why your word is better than their word. Because just becoming a thesaurus in your critique is, again, trying to change their style, trying to fit it into something that it might not be. Sometimes you run into the issue, like, have you ever read, like, say you were in high school and you had to exchange papers with somebody else to, like, work on critiquing their work, and you read through their manuscript, or their paper, I guess it wouldn't be a manuscript, and they used a lot of words that you look at them and you're like, I've known you for X amount of years. You don't know what that word means. And I'm reading it in context, and that's not what that word means. That's something you can run into by becoming a thesaurus in a critique partner situation. Because number one, you don't know exactly what they mean by each word that they use. Maybe because no two words mean the exact same thing. They all have very slight variations in what the specific term means. So if I have she tromped through the woods, and somebody highlights tromped, and they're like, no, she stalked through the woods. Stalked and tromped mean going through the woods, walking through the woods, but they have very different insinuations about how they're going about moving through the woods. They're very different, even though on the surface they might be synonyms. So just giving a synonym for a word that the author has used, you might be using the wrong word in the wrong context. So you could just be going through the thesaurus and picking a random word that's a synonym for walked, and it could be completely out of place in the scene. That's happened to me, where I've seen something that they wanted me to change it to, and I'm like, no, that doesn't fit at all. So when you're critiquing someone's work, don't just become a thesaurus. Don't just think like, oh, well, it's just you used walked, and I don't want you to use walked. I'm gonna choose a random other word. Or you used, I don't know, plotted, and I'm gonna say you need to use a different word. It's like, it's not necessary. Don't highlight the word door and say you need to change this to portal. Don't do that. Just don't. Now, one last thing that I'm going to talk about is when you go into critiques, don't assume that you know the world or the characters better than the author does. This might sound very obvious, but it is sadly not. In my experience, I've had many people say, this character shouldn't be acting that way, when they're like 2 chapters in, and it's like, excuse you, but I think I know my characters and what they would do better than you do. You're not supposed to know everything about each individual character or the world before you've even gotten halfway through the book. The first chapters are moments of realization, learning, kind of getting situated into the world, and when a character does an action, then you can file that away and say, okay, this is how they would react. Instead of saying, oh, well, this character was very loud and brash in this scene, but they're very meek and quiet in this other scene. That's inconsistent. You need to change that. Maybe take a step back and think, how are those 2 scenes different? How are they in different situations in those 2 scenes? If a character is in their hometown, surrounded by people they are comfortable with, and they act very loud and brash and extroverted in that scene, and then they In another scene, they're in a completely different town. They're alone. They don't know anyone there. They might be in a dangerous situation. If they're more meek and quiet in that scene than they were when they were in their hometown surrounded by people they love and care about and not in any danger, that's not a character inconsistency. That's just another aspect to that character. So when you're critiquing someone's work, don't go in thinking that the first scene that you see a character in is how they're going to act in every single situation. Don't think you know the character better than the author does, because you don't. Another thing is, don't assume you know the world better than the author does. I've had critiques come back on my chapters where two male characters were interacting in a way that they said, guys wouldn't use that language with each other. Guys wouldn't act that way with each other. And I'm like, number one, yeah, they would. Number two, this is a fantasy world, and our societal, mores don't always translate to fantasy worlds. In my fantasy world, there is no such thing as homophobia. People are gay, and everything in between, gay, straight, bi, pan, everything in between, and nobody is persecuted for it. It's a very open, accepted thing. Men are quite affectionate with each other, with people who they care about, with other men that they care about. They're quite affectionate. They don't see acting feminine as a bad thing. So, yeah, the characters were more physically close and were using more vulnerable language with each other than maybe the person who was giving the critique thought that their guy friends or guys in their lives would use. But that doesn't mean that that's not fitting for the story. If a character is acting in that sort of way in the story, maybe take a step back and think, oh, maybe their dynamics are different from our world, because this is a fantasy world. Another thing that people might point out is, oh, well, in medieval Europe, they wouldn't have acted like that. If it's a fantasy world, they're not in medieval Europe. So don't assume that, I feel it happens mostly with fantasy because people have a very expected time period that they think the fantasy is set in. So don't go into it like a fantasy book and think, okay, I know a whole bunch about medieval Europe, so I'm going to make sure that you are historically accurate. Because all your knowledge is useless. This is a fantasy world. It's not medieval Europe. It's a fantasy world that has its own history, its own gender dynamics, its own government types, all of these types of things. If a king is acting a certain way that you don't think that a historical king would have acted, maybe you can notate that and be like, oh, well, this doesn't seem like something a traditional king would do or act like or say. That's really interesting part of world building. I'm interested to see exactly how kings operate in your world versus how we're typically used to seeing them. That's a good comment to make in your critique. Having a comment that says, kings don't act like that. A king wouldn't do that. That's not helpful because you're assuming that you know the writer's, the author's world better than they do. And you don't. This also comes in with education level of characters. My main character is a girl from a village, and she knows some vocabulary words. She knows words that are not just peasant speak. And I've had critique partners highlight words and say, how does she know that word? It's like, 'cause she went to school. In my world, pretty much every single village, even very, very small ones, have a schoolhouse. Kids learn to read and write, and they learn a bit about history and arithmetic in every single size town or city, or even in the very poor districts. They do still have a basic education. So that's just another aspect of my world that you can just accept, that like, hey, maybe all peasants aren't dumb and have no vocabulary. Like, who said that all impoverished people are dumb? That's not a very good stereotype to fall into. All right, so thankfully we are all done with the don'ts of critiquing. So, as a review, do critique things in an open-minded way. Ask your critique partner what they want out of the critique. Go ahead and let them know in line the things that you really like, the things you're confused about, the predictions that you might start to have, and the feeling each scene is evoking in you, so that the author can get a really good idea of which sections exactly are making the reader connect to the story. Things to not do is to, kind of like in my video about critiquing mindsets, don't assume that you're a better writer. Don't think that your style of writing is the best style and they need to change it. Don't give the types of critiques that your critique partner did not ask for, and don't tell them to change certain things in their book because you, for some reason, think that you know their world and characters better than they do. So I hope that this video has helped you and given you some tools to go into critiquing works with, so that you can give the best types of critiques that are going to be the most useful to the authors, and kind of streamline your own critiquing process, so you don't have to spend hours going through and circling every grammatical mistake if they're not looking for a grammatical critique. It really can help you out as you're critiquing to keep in mind that you don't know the characters or world better than the author, so you can just sit back and let the story come to you rather than trying to fix every little issue that you think this story has based on your own preconceived notions. So kind of the whole gist is be open-minded when you're reading somebody's work, especially for the first time, especially the first couple chapters. Be very open-minded and open to what style of writing the author has, the voice that they have in their writing, the characters, and how you're learning about these characters as they're coming to you. You don't already know everything about the story, and that's a good thing. So critiquing as though you should already know everything about the story or about the person's writing style, it's not going to give a very helpful critique, and it's just going to waste your time and the person who's looking for the critique's time. I think that these tools will help you be a really, really great critique partner and help the person whose work you're critiquing become a better author for it. Let them know what they're doing right. Let them know what doesn't really land for you, some harmful things that might be in their work, and don't spend your time on meaningless things like becoming a thesaurus or thinking that you can change their writing style to fit your writing style. Go into it knowing that this is somebody else's writing, not yours. You are not writing this story. It is your job to be the reader and help the author know what's hitting, what's not, and maybe some things that they can change in order to make their story hit the way they want it to. I did go into a little bit about the specifics of how to actually word the critiques as you're going through somebody else's manuscripts, but in the next video, in this little critiquing series that I'm doing, I'm going to go even more into depth about exactly how to word your comments, say your inline comments or comments about stereotypes. I'm going to help you really word it in a way that's not attacking the person who's the author, not making them feel terrible about their writing, but rather inspiring them to be able to write even better and better and better every single time they go through a draft. So look forward to that. It should be up in like 2 weeks from now. I think I'm going to stick to 2 videos a month. So every other week, I'll have a new video about writing, editing, critiquing, that type of stuff up. So let me know if these have been helpful to you. I really, really hope they have. It's just some things that I've learned through my years of being a critique partner and also getting my own work critiqued. And every single day, I'm learning new things about critiques, new ways to critique better, and to help other people make their story as great as I know that they see it in their mind to be. So again, my name is April. This is High Fantasy Writing. So I do hope to see you in my next video about very specifically how to word your critiques comes out. All right, thank you so much for stopping by. If you did want to leave a like or a comment on this video to let the YouTube algorithm know that it was helpful to you, and maybe share it with some of your writing friends who you think could really benefit from this. It might be a little passive aggressive to send it to a critique partner, but I really hope that this can be a great resource for you as you're trying to figure out how to be the best critique partner you can be. All right, I hope you have a great rest of your day.